Hello, I am delighted to be joined today by Professor Sir Charles Godfray, who will deliver this year's City Food and Drink Lecture in London on the 15th of May. Sir Charles is the director of Oxford University's Oxford Martin School and its Future of Food programme. He has chaired the lead expert group of the UK government's Foresight project on the future of food and farming. And he recently, 18 months ago, he stepped down as chair of the Science Advisory Council of DEFRA. He is a population biologist. He's published research in the fields of ecology, evolution, and epidemiology. And he has a particular focus on the global food system and how it will need to change and adapt to the challenges of some of the main challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. In particular, he has a focus on sustainable intensification and the relationship between food production, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. And in 2017, he was knighted for services to scientific research and for scientific advice to government. So it's a pleasure to be with you today, Sir Charles.
Thanks, Fred.
I'd like to start by asking you about your research in the area of sustainable intensification. What do you mean by that?
So by sustainable intensification, I mean producing more food from the same amount of land with fewer effects on the environment. If one looks ahead for the next couple of decades, global populations are increasing, although the good news is that they're increasing at a decelerating rate. But one of the reasons that fertility is going down is that people are becoming wealthier, which is a good thing. We want to bring people out of poverty globally. But wealthier people demand food that require more resources to produce. So you can do the calculations in different ways, but almost certainly by mid-century, the second half of the century, we will need to, demand for food will go up 30 to 50%. And so where will that food come from? Now, if we throw ourselves back 50 years ago, 100 years ago, there were still large swathes of the earth that hadn't been turned into agricultural land. That option no longer exists. It no longer exists for two reasons. First of all, there isn't much of the earth that hasn't been turned into agriculture. And those bits that haven't, the Amazon forest, the Congo forest, the carbon costs of converting to them would be enormous, would be a real push for climate change. So if one has to produce more food going ahead, and one has to do it sustainably, then the only alternative is to increase food production from our current agricultural footprint. And that's what I mean by sustainable intensification.
Mm-hmm. And in horticulture more specifically, what would you say are the easy wins and what are some of the bigger challenges that producers have to overcome in pursuit of sustainable intensification?
Well, of course, horticulture is special because it has a relatively small land footprint compared with, for example, broadacre crops and the production of other food types. I think the elements of sustainable intensification that particularly apply to horticulture is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the excess use of water, and the excess pollutants that can go into the environment. And partly because of the relatively small footprint of horticulture, there is a lot of opportunity to do that. And we've seen some over the last couple of decades, some really interesting, intensive and sustainable horticultural production examples that have been developed. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a way that one can get greater agricultural yields and not have a hit on biodiversity, and actually to increase biodiversity. And this is by being really quite canny about how we use our land. The other thing that the government has committed to recently is a land use framework. And we shall, I think, see that in the next couple of months. I think it may be May that they said that they would produce it. And I don't think the land use framework, and I hope it won't be, a top-down diktat with zoning and things like that, But what I hope it will be is um, a scheme through which the various commitments government has made about land use, so food production, biodiversity, carbon storage, can be brought together in order to have greater food production and greater biodiversity. And that will design the incentives that will replace the common agricultural policy. And I think the way that I see it coming out is that land use will be a continuum, but it's helpful, I think, sometimes to talk about it in terms of three compartments, although realizing that that's to a certain extent an artificial construct. And a number of people have done this, including Henry Dimbleby in a national food strategy, so that there will be some land that is managed very largely for food production. I should stress sustainable food production, but there the aim is chiefly to produce food, which is a private good, which is then sold on markets. There will be other land which is managed for a multiplicity of output. So yes, food will be important, but so will habitats for biodiversity, so will carbon storage. And some of the money that originally went into the rural economy through CAP, I hope will be repurposed through the ELM scheme under the rubric of public money for public good to support these non-marketable goods that are produced.
And
And
do
then
you,
sorry,
sorry,
just to finish very, very finally, there's a third category, and some land I think will come out of agriculture for carbon storage and for rewilding as well. Now, I know that rewilding as a concept rather alarms the agricultural community, especially when people are too enthusiastic about it and are talking about very large swathes of the country being rewilded. I think we should see limited rewilding. I don't think we don't have the luxury for any of the land not to be productive, but I think productive should be interpreted in terms of the multiple outputs of land. So yes, some land will be really productive for food. Other land will be really productive for biodiversity. So if we do have a nature reserve, it needs to be the really best nature reserve. And I think rewilding, which is not just letting nature unaided colonize land, it's very much to me, rewilding will require as many people as farming does. So I think rewilding can actually generate jobs, but it should be designed in such a way as to produce wonderful biodiversity. I grew up in Somerset, and you only have to go down and look at the Somerset levels, where which are now engineered to be one of the most fabulous parts of Europe for wetland biodiversity. So it can be done. But I would say to my friends in the farming community, this is not an argument for rewilding large swathes of the countryside.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that in its current form, the ELM scheme includes enough incentive for farmers? One of the criticisms I've heard so far of certain aspects of it is that it actually just isn't, it doesn't make financial sense for growers to make some of these changes.
So I think ELMS at the moment is a little bit of a disappointment. I think irrespective of what you thought about Brexit, if you were a Brexiter or a Remainer, then given we are now outside the European Union, then reform of CAP was a silver lining. It is something that one can do. The CAP, almost by definition, it has to work from the Peloponnese to Lapland. So it's a fairly crude tool. And so we have the opportunity in the UK to work out a way of putting money into our rural communities that does multiple goods. And there was a document that came out of DEFRA 5 or 6 years back when Michael Gove was the Secretary of State, called Health and Harmony, which was a rather bizarre title, but at least in my view was one of the most interesting documents that came out of DEFRA or MAF before it since the Second World War. And that was a blueprint about how that might be done. And I think what we haven't seen so far is a pathway for implementation. I have huge sympathy for farmers who have really no idea what the shape of ELMS is going to be 2 or 3 years in advance. I think we are asking for really quite substantial change for land use in the UK. I think this has to be done in a just way so that people whose livelihoods depend on a certain mode of farming that will change in the future, are given a glide way to a different way of having a viable livelihood. To me, this is a process that will take between 10 or 20 years. It's also, I think, a process where there isn't a huge amount of political difference between the parties. There is some, but I don't think it's enormous. And I'm going to say something which is probably a little bit naive, but I would like to see some of this taken out of the political bear pit and a plan developed that will outlast not only this parliament, but the next parliament. And I think unless we have the capacity in the country to think in that medium to long term, we are firstly going to squander an advantage we now have of having our own land use policy, and we're going to let down both the natural world, but also many people who depend on the land for their livelihoods.
And moving back onto this concept of sustainable intensification, how optimistic are you about our collective potential as a globe to feed the world? And what measures do you think we can employ to help us achieve this?
Well, let me go on a brief digression. My title at Oxford is Professor of Population Biology. And although most of the populations I study are insects, pests and disease vectors, then I'm really interested in human populations as well. And without doubt, the most extraordinary thing that's happened in my adult intellectual life is that population growth has begun to decelerate. And this is a demographic transition. We did not know that 40 years ago. I genuinely tell my students that in my early 60s, I'm more optimistic about the future than I was when I was their age. 40 years ago, there was not an intellectual argument against Malthus. And Malthus, you recall, said that inevitably population growth would outpace our capacity to feed populations. We now know if you do the right things, if you bring people out of poverty, if you educate children, especially girls, if you provide access for reproductive health care, then human fertility, human fecundity naturally goes down. So to me, to put it crudely, it's game on. We can really look to a time where humanity's demands on the natural environment for resources will plateau and go down. So I am optimistic, but without in any sense undermining the big challenges ahead. 40 years ago, we didn't know about the demographic transition, but we didn't know much about climate change either. I think you can throw up your hands in despair at the problem of feeding 10 billion people. It looks so complicated. Yeah. We talk about food systems. People draw these hugely complicated maps where everything is related to each other. And it is generally complicated, but it's also really simple. And the simple bit is we need action on all fronts. Now, you can actually divide up the food system in different ways. The way I like to think about it is in terms of 4 components. We need to produce more food sustainably, and that to me is sustainable intensification. We need to have hard discussions about diet change, both for health and for the environment. And I'm afraid when it comes to the environment, then we will need to, as a globe, consume less meat, especially ruminant meat, because that of all food types is the one with the greatest greenhouse gas emissions. We must bear down on food waste. And I'm really enthusiastic about food waste, but I worry sometimes when food waste is seen as a magic bullet. Yes, we should bear down on food waste, but some food waste is going to be really hard to get rid of. And some food waste, it makes no sense to get rid of. Actually, we could reduce food waste by using more plastic, but plastic has its own problems. In developing countries, in hot countries, we could bring in more coal supply chains, but that has greenhouse gas issues as well. So yes, bear down on food waste, but it's not the magic bullet that sometimes I've seen people say it is. And finally, and this is a sort of complex, nerdy thing, we need to look at the governance of the food system. Some people worry about we now live in a globalized food system. I think a globalized food system is absolutely essential. If you are, for example, the Minister of Food in Egypt, you're never going to feed a population of, I think, getting on to 200 million from a strip of land up the Nile and a couple of oases. So we really need a well-functioning global food system. And I rather follow the economist Joseph Stiglitz, who in one of his books on globalization said the challenge is not to get rid of globalization, but for it to work for multiple stakeholders, especially the less powerful. And again, I think we need a globalized food system that will reliably provide the food that people need, especially in low-income countries.
Mm-hmm. And that final point about the interconnectedness of the global food system leads on quite nicely to my next question, which is about the resilience of our international food system, and what you think has been learned from both the COVID pandemic and then the war in Ukraine. What lessons can we take from those two big global shocks?
So it's a great question, that. And I guess for about 15 years since I did the report for the Government Office of Science on the future of food and farming, I've been banging on about the resilience of the global food system. I've pointed out that if you look at the companies involved in the global food system, in commodity trading, there are a relatively small number of companies. They tend to be, well, I think all the big four are private companies, so a relatively fewer information available compared with a publicly listed companies. And I have talked about, well, surely we should be stress testing the food system, the global commodity food system, in a way we all wish we'd been doing it with the banks in the early 2000s. And I bumped into someone from a major international commodities firm recently who reminded me of me lambasting them on this at some panel 5 years ago. And he said, well, we've had the pandemic and we've had the war in Ukraine, and there were some disruptions, but relatively few disruptions. And I do think that is a fair point. If you had been interviewing me in January 2020 and had a crystal ball and said what would happen if we'd had the pandemic, if we'd had the horrible war in Ukraine, I would have been far more pessimistic about the things that have happened. And I'm not saying that nothing has happened, and especially though some people in low-income countries have really suffered, but it has been nowhere near as disruptive as I thought it would. So I take two lessons from that. One is that there has been a stress test, so I am more optimistic about the global food system than I was, but one has to worry about the dangers of being complacent. So I still think one should be stress testing. I think if anything, then the companies involved should feel more confident going into that process, and I think that they might have been 5 or 6 years ago.
Another huge challenge for the globe is how to tackle food poverty. How much responsibility do you think food producers and retailers and other private businesses should bear for this? And what role can the private sector play? Or do you think it's more a responsibility for national governments?
That's a question with many, many different components to it. But if I can give a sort of oversimplified answer, I do think it is more the responsibility of national governments than it is the private sector. I think the private sector is what the private sector is out there to make money. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. And for me, the role, so, and they make money within the market. Now, you will have some of the sort of more fundamental economists who talk about markets as these magical self-organized entities, which should be touched at your peril, should just be allowed to self-organize. As someone who's worked a lot on complex systems, I don't buy that at all. Markets are social constructs. I think the challenge for governments is to construct markets in such a way as they they provide the boundary conditions within which the private sector can work efficiently, and for both its to enable it to make money itself, but that it also has social purpose. I think the responsibilities of the private sector is first not to interfere with governments trying to set markets up for multiple purposes. So I think that some of the lobbying that the private sector can do much more on the other side of the Atlantic than this can be doctrinaire and counterproductive. Certainly with some of the private sector companies I work with, I am impressed that, yes, of course, they need to make a profit. Yes, of course, they talk about shareholder value, but they also talk about purpose of the company. They also talk about multiple stakeholders, not only the shareholders. I think we are seeing a movement, slower than I would like, to think about multi-stakeholder capitalism rather than the rather silly, in my view, tyranny of stakeholder value. I think it's also a really interesting point. You mentioned food poverty, and if we talk about it just in the UK for the moment, then the degree to which that is a problem within the food system, and the degree to which it's the result of the political choices that we've made only over many years about how we share the benefits of wealth amongst different parts of society. And I think sometimes there are problems that are ascribed to the food system that are actually broader. I think if one looks globally at hunger, so I'm now not talking about sort of food poverty, I'm talking about real hunger, then the World Food Programme, who collects statistics on this, point out that the majority of cases of hunger and such come because people do not have access to food because they're unfortunate enough to live in areas of civil conflict or of war. So again, that's outside the food system. I think that when one looks at other aspects of food poverty and some of the indirect aspects, so if you are on a very low income, I think the phrase that's sometimes put about just about managing, that is a tough life, and you don't have the sort of cognitive bandwidth to make really difficult decisions about food choice and things like this. I really do stress it's not a question of being stupid, but if you're really, really sort of trying to make ends meet, and you have to put food on your table for your children, things like that, then popping into a really cheap fast food chicken place that produces food that presses all our buttons, salty and fatty and things, then it's no wonder that there is a correlation between income and obesity and malnutrition and things like that. So I think there is a role for government to try and make it easier for people who are living really, really tough lives to be able to get better diets. Full disclosure, I'm a trustee of the Food Foundation, which is a little NGO, a little charity, which I think does wonderful work advocating in this area. It is very strong about free school meals and the advantage of that. And Henry Dimbleby in the National Food Strategy also talked a lot about that. It's great to see it happening in London. And I think those are the things that could be done. I would like to see government being braver about regulating. There's a phrase, the obesogenic landscape. So you're surrounded by these very cheap, fatty, salty foods. You're bombarded by advertisements for them. I would like to see government being braver to stand up to some of the right-wing press who will talk about the nanny state and such.
So it sounds like you stand with Henry Dimbleby on some of his criticisms of the government's inaction on obesity. Just a few days before this interview, he resigned from DEFRA. What do you make of the current government's efforts to tackle obesity and other diet-related disease in Britain?
So I think we have gone backwards on that. So there was a period, I think it was late 2020, where Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, had his COVID scare and was aware that his weight was a major contributor to that. And there was a moment there where it did look like there was going to be movement on some of the well, precisely some of the things we've just been talking about. And I think in the complexities of the turmoil of the government over the next 18 months of that, some lobbying from people who have a very free market libertarian view, I think that the government retreated from that, and I regret that. I would like to see more being done on obesity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the big document published by Henry Dimbleby a couple of years ago was followed up by the government's food strategy last year. That was criticised by Mr. Dimbleby himself and others in the food sector for lacking detail, for lacking binding promises, and it gave the impression to some that the government maybe isn't serious about introducing a sustainable food system. In what areas in particular would you like to see the government firm up its commitments and in some people's eyes get serious about the problems?
Yes, and I largely agree with the criticisms of the government response. Having worked closely with DEFRA and having huge admiration for many of the people who work in DEFRA, they have had a very tough 3 years, both with the pandemic and Brexit, and they're dealing with a retained legislation bill at the moment. So if I was trying to defend DEFRA, I'd say that they have had limited headspace to sort of think about these things. Nevertheless, I'm disappointed. I would like things to go further. I think we've largely talked about some of the things that I'd like to see implemented. So trying to bear down on the obesogenic landscape, things such as targeted interventions such as free school meals, which do cost money. I'm really clear about that, but not that amount of money. On the other side, on the production side, then getting elms right. And again, we've talked about the long-term things. It is inevitable that if we are going to meet our national net zero commitments and the globe to meet net zero commitments, we need to have really hard discussions about diet. And government, I think, are very, very frightened about talking in that area. And I regret that. I think that Dimbleby steered really quite a smart middle path in that topic, and I'm sorry that the government haven't taken that as a lead.
Mm-hmm. And just finally on net zero, there have been lots of commitments made both at government level and by various food businesses and producers. How realistic are those commitments, and what kind of scale of transformation do they really require? Because it seems that we've heard a lot of bold pledges which aren't necessarily backed by concrete action.
Yes, I mean, one of the things where I think that, and it's not just one government, but a number of governments have done well, is they set up the Climate Change Committee, which is sort of independent, has a brief to comment on how we're progressing towards net zero. They produce reports regularly. If I could sort of paraphrase a very large number of very interesting reports, movements in the right direction, but nowhere near fast enough. I think we are hitting the point where I'm not sure exactly what the correct metaphor is. The rubber hits the road, or something to do with fans, where we have to actually invest in what this might be. Let me take a non-food example. So if we are to meet our electric vehicle charging, We should be doing massive investment in recharging networks at the moment. I think if we look at what's happening in the States, so the Biden, it was called the Inflation Reduction Act, but had a huge green technology component to it. It looks like the EU is going to, if not match it, then do something substantial there. There is discussion, I think, within the opposition at the moment more than the government about exactly what an equivalent investment would be in this country. So I do see room for hope, but we do have to get cracking on it.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you ever so much, Sir Charles Godfray. I mean, I can't wait to hear your lecture on the 15th of May. I'm sure it will include lots of very interesting insights. And as you say, there are huge challenges that we face, both as a nation and globally.
Thanks very much, Fred. I've enjoyed our discussion.